I'm Martin Howe. I am the co-chair of the technical committee. I also run my own business called Tech4. We do tech things. Somebody asked me earlier, what's my superpower name? Well, I'm not entirely sure I'm worthy of one, but because of my very unusual accent, when I talk to people from this side of the pond and say I'm Martin Howe, they say, Monty Hell? You're Monty Hell, really? So perhaps you just call me Hellboy. So from henceforth, I'll be Hellboy.
You wish. You wish.
That's a good one. Yeah, is that right? You wait to hear yours.
I like it.
Yours is coming. So first up, let me just position what we're going to do next. So just after we finished Digs and before our last expo, that kind of time scale, we were saying, well, what comes ahead of Digs? So Digs tries to define and recommend performance characteristics for theatres, in particular regarding digital systems. Well, how do you get from, as we've just seen, how do you get from the field and capture digitally all the way through that process onto the screen? And actually, I didn't really know. I've got an understanding briefly, but not the fine detail of tips, tricks, and bits of tech to do that. So that was my question. So guys, how can we help me and everybody else understand this workflow from camera to screen? And so we coined the term production and post-production workflow, P3W for short, and we volunteered Christian to help us with that. And under extreme duress, he took up the challenge and has been working with a team, which hopefully you'll just explain to us who's been on board the P3W task force shortly. But a team, as always, of people from the tech committee and beyond have brought together a series of documents that are in draft form now, and we'll orientate you towards them in just a little moment, of the process and the stages of best practice of P3W. So without any further ado, let me introduce our two superheroes to take us through this session. We have Christian, of course, Captain America. Fry.
Wow.
Woo! And he's already announced himself as our own secret agent, Myles 007 Connolly. Gentlemen, over to you.
My superpower is sleeping, if anyone's curious. So thanks for having us here today. Christian is probably going to lead off and talk a little bit more about the background of how we came up with this really complex document. And just so you know, what you're seeing here on the screen is the very simplified and easy version. We're not going to bore you with a bunch of details and go through it step by step. Yeah, Christian, just sort of walk us through how we got here.
Sure. This has been a really interesting process, and I want to acknowledge a couple of people at the outset that have been really helpful. Rick Tester helped put this diagram together and provided a lot of great insight.
From on-site.
From on-site, yeah. Phil Strother, who's always a kind of bellwether person in our technical group. Myles, of course, and there's Brian Eimer and Tim Archer on the audio side, so you guys had an opportunity to listen to Tim talk today about audio workflow. So this diagram is really the picture side, but I want to give you a little background kind of on myself and where this process, the kind of genesis of this process. I made my first giant screen film, Air Racers 3D, came out in 2012. I started shooting that film back in 2009. Really at the beginning of, we were one of the first fully digital products to come to the giant screen. Initially we were shooting on Red 1s, and at that time it was a pretty new technology, and certainly some of the things we were doing in 3D were challenging. And ultimately, in going through that process as the producer of the film and then ultimately as one of the co-directors, the post-production process and workflow was kind of mystifying to me in some ways, and a lot of things were being kind of figured out as we went. And I in coming to the GSCA as a new filmmaker, I had so many questions, so many things that I was curious about, like really what are the differences between producing for giant screen and producing for other mediums? And obviously we have the giant screen, and as we've talked about in a lot of sessions here, it doesn't hide much. The flaws become very apparent very easily if you're not taking the right steps, not only on the capture side, but also all the way through the post process. And we had some great stuff if you were in the theater today, really looking at the concept of doing a digital remaster or an up-res. These are very important steps, but it's easy for those choices to be destructive. And we talked a lot about this when the production and post-production workflow task force started to work, that the goal for every filmmaker should be a non-destructive workflow. And that sounds easy, but it's actually very easy, and Myles and I will visit with you all a bit about this today, to make choices, whether it's the way you set up your camera, choosing some sort of compression that ultimately may degrade the total quality of the image, the wrong sharpening pass. All of these things have to be really considered by, from my perspective, the producers at the beginning of pre-production. You can't leave the idea of this workflow to post. You have to talk about this when you're beginning to work on the film to make sure, has been mentioned many times, that you've budgeted appropriately for each of these steps, thought about the processes. And the other thing that has been really great for me, and Myles and I talked a lot about this as well, this is a very unique piece in the overall entertainment landscape, giant screen. Because of these conferences and the kinds of connections that we all make, people are willing to share. So if you're making a giant screen film, whether you're a seasoned filmmaker or this is your first one, reach out to the people in this association. Most of the people here have probably tried whatever you're considering, and you can save so much time, aggravation, and money by just connecting with the people in this room.
Pain and suffering.
Pain and suffering, exactly. So, but I think that the existence of the symposium over this last couple of days, I was certainly really thrilled in visiting with Tammy and Kelly about the possibility of doing this, because when I first entered the GSCA, this was a big question for me as a relatively new producer to the world. Where do we get all this information? Who do I need to talk to? And I always thought an event like this would be a great way to share this information in kind of a public forum, and that's exactly what's happened. So I'm thrilled we're here. I'll take just a couple minutes, and Myles and I will kind of walk you through this workflow a little bit.
A quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just see a show of hands of how many people have never actually made an IMAX film? Right, okay. Just because there are some very technically savvy people in this audience, and I don't want to be telling like Sean Phillips how 3D works or something like that. So, okay, great. That helps me a lot. Thank you.
So the basic workflow kind of starts on the left-hand side with your capture choice. So are you shooting film? Are you shooting digital? Are you shooting a combination of those things, as many films do? We also then, there's a supporting document which will come out here in the next couple of months, we hope, where each box will have some additional detail. And our goal is actually to create a wiki page, or a technical wiki, I guess we're calling it. There went my mic.
Try again.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, so a technical wiki on the GSCA website where this diagram will live, and then you can click on an individual box to get more information. But for the purposes of this, we'll kind of run through it briefly. And again, if you've got questions, you can certainly talk to Myles or I after, and we'll try and give you some more detail on it on an individual box. But it begins with the capture choice. So at the top, you can see shooting 1570, there it is. You shoot that film, it heads to the lab, you develop the film, you telecine it, and then that moves you into the yellow offline creative editorial box. The digital capture section has quite a number of other steps, some of which have been discussed already this week. I don't think we can ever underestimate the value of a DIT to manage your data and make sure that that's all been logged and backed up. That's mentioned here. And you know, some pretty intricate steps, LTO being a great way, tape backup of data is something that we like to suggest to people. And then transcoding your original footage into some sort of proxy. Certainly we've heard producers and editors talk here about editing in their entire workflow being 4K and potentially 3D 4K. When we edited Air Racers, we did it that way. The entire post-process, we never used a proxy. So we edited the entire film in native resolution in 3D, which adds a lot of complexity on levels. And I don't know, maybe Myles has a comment about that. But
I have a comment about everything, just so you know.
So that the blue box on the capture side there for digital kind of gives you a bunch of detail, and then ultimately it flows into offline editorial. We don't need to spend a lot of time there because I think we all know what editing is. Once that edit is complete, then there's a box that'll take you back to the film lab, creating a 1565 negative, and doing a digital scan of that. But the big one, and the one that has been talked about in detail today, begins with box 20 there, Master 3D DI Pipeline. So this is kind of the heart of the matter, what we would refer to as DI, and the steps that are critical to consider there, and the one that was discussed where we had some great examples on the screen today, I think is box 28, Image Processing Enhancement. So that would be your digital remaster. So a lot of these things are, a little box doesn't do a lot of justice to how large a step that is and how critical a piece of the process that is, but we'll get into some more detail on that. And then as you move right chart, 2D reversioning, dome reversioning, these are obviously critical steps that seem sort of small here, but they're pieces. Anyway, so I think what we're going to do to make this a little more digestible for you is we'll just kind of keep this casual. Myles and I will kind of talk a little bit, and I'll throw some questions at him in terms of really the goal here is to try and help you guys understand primarily two things, I think. One, where are the differences? Where are the what are the most critical boxes in terms of the differences between producing for giant screen and producing for other medium? And I think that's probably the primary thing, yeah?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds good. So Christian did his own little intro. I'll just, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm sure that there are many, many, I'm a giant screen filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. I've been in this industry since 1991. I worked for Greg McGillivray at McGillivray Freeman Films for almost 10 years and had the luxury of not only shooting with film, but editing on film and enjoying the pristine wonder of giant screen IMAX prints from their actual original negative. And then about 10 years ago, I started producing and was riding the wave of digital technologies that came along, and have been working with companies like BBC Earth, National Geographic, SK Films, and a whole slew of other ones. Films that you may have seen that I've been a part of are Everest, The Living Sea, Samsara, Flight of the Butterflies, and things like that. So I'm really, really lucky because I started out in post as a picture editor, and worked on film, and then worked on digital nonlinear, and then moved into producing and have shot 3D for 10 years, or maybe a little bit more than that, both on film and digitally. So I'm not an expert on anything, but I know enough about everything to be dangerous. And that helps me get on these panels. So this workflow is the effort of a lot of really smart people, and it's a great place to start. But nobody should be looking at this as the end-all, be-all document that defines their workflow. Every single project is unique. It has its own specific demands. It has its own budget. It has its own schedule. There's really no right way to do this. There are plenty of wrong ways to do it, but there's no single right way to do it. So when we're up here and we're presenting and we're claiming a certain level of knowledge, just know that you and your own experience may be completely different from that. And we've seen that recently with some new filmmakers of the industry who've done things on their own and done it quite successfully. And you know, so we're here to discuss and raise questions, to learn from you, hopefully, if you've got new ideas and new ways of doing things, whether you're a first-timer or a 30-year seasoned veteran. We're always looking for new technology, new methods, and just new ideas, ways to make these movies better. It's a very competitive marketplace. We're trying to make the best movies we can within a sort of limited box sometimes. And if you've got a way to do it and make it better, by all means share it with us. We want to know. So the giant screen is challenging, and Sean touched on this the other day, and I was thinking about it last night. It's amazing, you know, when you go out there and you shoot something, and and you're looking at it in the field, and then you come back and you're editing, you're looking at it on a monitor, and then you go to your DI suite, and if you're lucky, maybe you've got like a 15-foot DI screen. You're never really looking at your movie. And I've worked on films for a year in post. I mean, Everest, we were working on it for a long time, right, Alex? It was like a year, maybe a year and a half in post. I probably watched that movie 500 times. The first time I saw it in IMAX was like seeing it as if I'd never seen it before. So there is a translation that's at the heart of this process. And we don't have the luxury of printing things. You know, we can't print 15 perf dailies, I wish. But you need to be very conscious of what the end result will be when you're starting out this process, whether it's film or digital. You need to know where you're going to be and what the expectation is, so that, as Christian said, you can be planning for it from the very beginning. We talk about a lot of these things amongst ourselves all the time, because we've all made the mistakes, we've burned our fingers and had our regrets, and we're here to try and help everybody else not go through that process. So, you know, I was a young male filmmaker, testosterone driven at one point, and I can remember thinking, I know how to do everything and I'm going to do it myself. And now, looking back, I see how foolish I was. So if you're embarking on a giant screen project, please, please, please reach out to us. We're really friendly. We want to help you make a good movie, because your good movie is going to bring audiences to the theater and help us with our movies, you know. If you make a really bad movie and it does somehow get onto screens and people have a bad experience, it's like going to a restaurant and having a bad meal. You don't typically go back to that restaurant again. So our motivation in helping you isn't to make money or to get a job. It's to help you make the best movie that you can make. Technology is constantly evolving. Do the due diligence. You know, I work with some of the best camera people in the world, and they will tell you that it's a full-time job just staying across all of the technology as it's developing. There are new chips, there are new cameras. You know, this A7S camera is amazing for a very limited number of applications. It will turn night into day, but a lot of people are looking for the silver bullet solution. They're trying to find the one device that does everything, and there isn't one. So please do the due diligence, make sure that you know what you're getting into. Don't be enamored by marketing materials or the fact that, you know, David Fincher just bought 10 of them. Make sure that your needs are the same as David Fincher's needs, if you're so lucky, and then, you know, make choices accordingly.
Hey, Myles, so I have a kind of I think it's an interesting thing, this technology point that you're making, because if we begin at the workflow with the camera choice, which is really where we're at with a lot of the technology questions, I think it's so important for people to understand that you know, good stuff in equals good stuff out. And if you make great decisions about the camera, how the camera's set up, lens choices, all of these things, can you just speak a little bit to kind of what you might think are the key choices when you're evaluating the camera choice?
Sure. So the one key choice is always film versus digital. And there are a lot of dynamic factors that help you make that choice. But, and you saw some stuff today. I mean, the digital technology is advancing at a really rapid pace, but it's still, in its current state, just barely good enough for giant screen. 15 perf 65 is still the gold standard, both literally and figuratively. It's expensive. It's time consuming. It's heavy. But, you know, we all know that process. The photochemical process has been around more than 100 years. We're all very comfortable with that and can get the best out of it. With the digital technology, it's a little different. And so, you know, it's very easy to get caught up in 4K, 6K, and in sort of the latest, again, marketing, whatever else. But you really have to look at what your end deliverable is and figure out what is the best format, capture format for that. You know, I miss film. There was a time, where did I wrote it down? In the film days, here's how you would prep for a shoot. You'd pick your stocks, you'd then go out and shoot, you'd process the 35mm print downs, you'd run the edge codes, and you'd be ready to go. With digital, we have to figure out the workflow, because there's about 1 million different workflows. We have to do that in advance, not when we arrive at location. You've got to go out and shoot camera tests like crazy. You've got to figure out, you know, additional demands for 4K, 3D production. There's just, it's a laundry list of stuff with the digital. And we were talking about this before. With film, of course, you can make mistakes. You can get the focus wrong, you can get the stop wrong, But the number of ways to screw up film is pretty limited, and we've all made those mistakes, so we've learned by doing. With digital, there are so many choices that you make that you may not actually understand the implications of them until you're downstream in post, you know. And because digital is very attractive to young camera people, and I'm like to think that it's attractive to me, you know, we tend to gravitate towards the sort of flashy new digital stuff, but it's very easy for people who don't have experience to just sort of make a choice like, oh yeah, 20:1 compression, no, that's great because we'll get more media on the drive. And then later on, you're in post and you're like, how come all these shots are at 20:1 compression? Oh, because, you know, the first AC, who's got 2 years of experience, decided that that's what the setting was going to be. Well, that's a tragedy. So again, with the digital technology, there are a lot of really fantastic developments there, a lot of advantages that digital has over film, but at the end of the day, it's also in many ways a riskier effort. So when you talk about choices, you know, film versus digital is a critical one. The second one is lenses. You know, I talk to people all the time, and they're like, "Oh yeah, no, we've got the greatest and latest Canon, you know, still photo lens." And I'm like, "Well, a still photo lens is maybe going to be good enough for giant screen, but really you should be shooting with cinema lenses." And people just, they don't understand. And I think at the heart of it is this understanding. Those of us who've been doing this for a long time, we can look at something on the giant screen and see, you know, the quality or lack of quality, and we can usually tell where that issue started. But if you haven't made 30 or 40 IMAX films, 30 or 40 giant screen films, you may think that, you know, a Tamron still lens that shoots at a 1.2 is going to be good enough for the giant screen. So it goes back to that conversation, like, you know, even though you think it's a good idea, even though that lens is a good deal, and you've seen amazing write-ups in the still camera magazines, you know, talk to people that know and express to them what you're trying to do. And if you're on a budget, say, well, we're on a budget and this is why we're doing it. We all make choices, but if you talk to us, we can sometimes help steer you in the right direction. Like maybe there's a used cinema lens that you can rent and get better quality rather than buying the latest and greatest still photo lens. It's going to ultimately result in lesser quality.
Choices. It's kind of amazing, and I think that's ultimately what this workflow is designed to do, is to help you think about the choices that you're going to make. As Myles said, this isn't the answer, and we know, and I think most of the people here can agree, this workflow may be valid today, but it could very well change in the next 6 months. And I think it's just trying to help you make good choices, good decisions. And glass is one that comes up a lot in the technical committee, because you can have this spectacular camera, pick a bad piece of glass, and whatever's ending up on that sensor is not as good as it could be. So this is a little bit of a roadmap to making those good choices. Yeah.
And I have to give a little shout out to Greg McGillivray, which is, you know, Greg was a big mentor and the person that taught me probably more than anyone else about large format. And for Greg, the number one thing is quality of experience. And he will tell you that that's what keeps people coming back. And he will do his very best to not cut corners, to make sure that you know, what shows up on screen is as good as it can be. And I have a lot of respect for that. I'm surrounded by people all the time who want to do that, but, and I'm guilty of it too, we all have, you know, limitations on budget or schedule or something else. And the shortcuts and the temptations are in, you know, in the thousands. So, you know, learning at the feet of Greg about how to maintain quality, make sure that the films are very good, positive experiences has helped me carry on, you know, through my career, and I think in large part is why I've been successful. But he will ask, you know, questions that are really hard questions, like, well, what's the glass? You know, what are the lenses you're going to use? Why are you not shooting on film? And you should have really, really good, solid answers, because if you don't, he'll just stare at you like you're an idiot. Like, you know, don't you understand that this is what's going to end up on screen? So, yeah, choices, critical.
Choices. So we talked a little bit about capture, and that's obviously a topic that is deep and wide, and we could go on and forever, but let's, in the interest of time, we'll kind of keep stepping through. So let's talk a little bit about DIT and media management. Obviously, as you pointed out, in some ways, film was a little easier, certainly different in that way. Now we have this digital image technician. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of that and some, in your experience, steps that you don't want to miss.
Yeah, I mean, film is easier on a lot of levels, but you've never tried to clear 40 reels of 65 through Egypt customs either. So I can tell you that there are definitely times when it's a bit of a nightmare. So, you know, I say to the guys all the time, when we're out there in the field and we're spending, you know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, and it's all going on to these little drives, like that represents the entire effort. And you know, it's one thing if you're shooting a drama and you can file an insurance claim and go back with the actors and wardrobe and do it again. It's another thing if you're out shooting an eclipse or a lion snatching an antelope out of the air. Like, insurance doesn't get that back. It just pays for what you've lost. So, you know, very often when we go out, we will make sure that not only do we have a DIT who really understands the process, understands the workflow, but also that we have equipment that's up to date and capable. You know, there's nothing worse than getting out in the field and having your DIT say, oh, you know, I thought this was going to go smoother. You say, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, you know, everybody told me 4K would be fine, but what they didn't understand is that it's 4K times 2 because we're shooting in 3D. So, you know, the DIT is probably the most thankless job because those guys typically, you know, media managers, DITs, they're up all night, they're changing drives, they're swapping stuff out. But they're also, it's one of the linchpin crew roles. You know, I talk about linchpin roles because there are some people on the crew where if you lose them, your production is dead. And sadly, it's not always the director, you know, but it is usually your cinematographer. Oftentimes it's your DIT. Like, there are just roles where if it goes bad with that person, they get hit by a truck, you could be done for a while. So we try and take care of the DITs. We give them plenty of time because there's also fatigue issues. You know, if somebody's been working 18 hours and they're supposed to be doing a checksum and something slips by, like, you know, they reformat the card, it's going to be bad. So we are all about redundancy in the field. You know, we take the cards, we back them up 3 times. We download them to a spinning drive, we back that up to a second spinning drive, then we go to an LTO. And we don't wait, we immediately move those things to 3 different locations. Because there have been times, there was a time in Tanzania where the tent caught on fire. And there was a bunch of drives in Pelican cases in the tent, and I was like, well, at least we have the backups, right? The guy's like, it's all there, it's all in the tent. It's like, well, that's a bad way to do that. So, you know, we back up, and again, it's a pain in the ass. I'll be perfectly honest. It takes a lot of time, and there's added expense to doing that. But that's what you have to do. With digital, you have to get the backups.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, just so you kind of pointed out some things that I've talked to other people about here. DIT, it's real easy to, if you have a time-lapse unit, say, to dump that work onto the key of that unit and say, well, you know, our DIT is kind of overloaded. Why don't you take the time to start backing up all your own stuff? This can really, I think, affect creativity, and you're not allowing your keys to really do their job. You have to budget appropriately for this role. It sounds like kind of not that important. Somebody can transfer files. Having a dedicated person to manage that data all the way from the minute it comes out of the camera and get it into those 3 locations so that you're safe. It's really, I think, just a kind of overlooked sometimes, but super critical role.
Here's a nightmare scenario that happened to me. I won't mention the film, but it was successful in the end in spite of this. But we were on location. The DIT had been brought in at the last minute, claimed that it was all good, he could do the job, everything was fine. Couldn't do the job, couldn't get the new software to do what we needed, ended up working sort of 16 to 18 hours a day, started copying footage from the card with the same roll number, so camera roll and take, over pre-existing rolls and takes from earlier days. And so when we got back from location and the director was saying, you know, I remember there was another take that was better than this, and we started going through it, we realized that this guy had accidentally written over some of the takes. How many takes? 47 takes, right? So then you start going through it and you're like, well, what were those 47 takes? Oh, you know what? A couple of those would have been nice to have in the movie. So again, you just have to be really conscious of the knock-on effects of not only the technology, but also the human aspect of it, and just make sure that, yeah, you're covered.
We had a great session at the Toronto or the trade show event, and Matt Scott, who's the guy from USC, who's a DIT as well, talked a lot about being remote. There are things you have to budget for. He needed clean generated power in these remote locations to make sure that that DIT cart with its RAIDs and all that computer stuff is safe. So there's all sorts of budgeting pieces for the producers in the room. Don't skimp on this for the reasons that were just named. This is a critical hire. He's a linchpin guy, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit more about offline. You know, offline is often sort of like, oh, that's the easy part, that's just editing. But I can tell you as an editor that it is one of the most grueling jobs. I've pulled way more all-nighters in post-production than I ever did in production. Like, I've worked many days straight through with no sleep in post. It is also such an important part of the process. So when we are setting up projects now, you know, not only do we talk about how we're going to capture stuff, but we talk about how we're going to edit things, because there's so many choices. Do you take an HD feed out of the Red camera and copy that on an external recorder? Do you transcode stuff? Do you edit in 4K? Like, you know, there's just so many choices. So understanding how you're going to offline your project well in advance and what the limitations are, and even running some tests. Like, you know, we know people now that are cutting in 4K 3D. I can tell you the amount of investment and time to get that sorted out is significant. Personally, I don't know why you do it, but it's your call. But anyway,
I wouldn't do it again.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that everything you see on this document is really an integrated whole. There's nothing here that stands separate from the rest of it. What you choose to do at the front end is going to affect everything downstream from there. So yeah, the offline process, critical.
Is there, you and I have talked about a couple pieces related to offline. I have kind of two questions. One, I think it's important to just mention to people pace, and that there are some differences, kind of radical differences for giant screen. And the second one, you talked a lot about the importance of big monitors and even having reference to a human being on your monitor so you have some sense of scale.
So one of my editing heroes is Walter Murch, and he has this technique where when he's cutting a film, he'll put in one of the lower corners a human being silhouette to scale. So if it's a 50-inch monitor, that person's down in the lower corner and represents how big a human being would be on a, you know, relative to a cinema screen. And I do that too when I'm cutting giant screen films, because it is so hard to truly comprehend how big that screen is going to be, and you just need a constant reminder. As Christian says, there's something to be said about pacing. I don't know how many people got to see the Ocean Men clip yesterday, but that's just a revelation, right? Like, you know, if you told me going into it, oh no, we're going to have 6 shots in 2 minutes and it's going to be great, I'd tell you were crazy. But then when you watch it and the way that it plays, you can't help but get sucked into it. So there's a lot of talk about, you know, field trip audiences and what kids are used to and attention spans and things like that. But I think good content that's allowed to play will always engage the audience no matter what the age is. So, you know, understanding pacing, understanding how, you know, cutting rhythms and emotional dynamics and all that stuff is critical to success on the giant screen.
Yeah, and I think we even talked a little bit about it, that the choice of how you pace the cuts ultimately lends to the immersive reality of giant screen. Long, wow moment shots, as we've talked about, are important, and important to consider early.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like, we've got an Africa film coming out, BBC Earth's Wild Africa, and there's a crocodile sequence in there where the wildebeest come down and have a drink, and lo and behold, the crocodiles are there to eat them. And the editorial pace of that is so good, and the way that it builds and builds and builds, and then when it kicks off, it just turns into this rock and roll sequence almost. But you know, that is almost a master class of editorial pacing and emotional build-up and payoff. It's really good.
Would you suggest it's valuable for first-time filmmakers to look at successful giant screen films as some indication of what?
Yeah, I mean, I would say anytime you're going to get into an industry, whether it's giant screen or television or music videos, you should be watching as much of that as you can. And especially if you're even contemplating, you know, 3D, you should be out there watching every 3D movie you can, because all of this stuff takes time to absorb. You know, just going out and seeing a couple of them will be entertaining, and you might walk away with a few ideas. But you know, for me, I don't know, I've seen probably 100 giant screen films over the years, and I still learn something from every single one. So, and sometimes the lessons you learn are how not to do things.
Can be equally valuable. All right, so let's move into a little bit to DI, which is probably the biggest single element of this production and post-production workflow. There's a lot of pieces we could talk about. What do you think's worth diving into here?
I think just the nature of the audience, we'll keep it fairly top level. So for those of you that don't know, DI is a process, I think it started out as digital intermediate, which is a film throwback, but the reality is that it's where these days the movie is made in terms of color, contrast, brightness, all the things that, clean up, sharpening, denoise, all of these things that are done. It's an expensive process, it's a time-consuming process, but there's an expectation on the part of audiences for images to look pristine and beautiful and great, and the DI is the way that it's done. So we typically, when we're shooting 6K for 4K mastering, we will go into the DI with the very highest level quality, and we'll work on that stuff. We'll conform it to our locked picture cut, and then we'll go through and we'll do multiple passes. So we might do a single pass that's all about just reducing noise in the shots, and we'll do a sharpening pass to just make sure that every shot looks optimal. We'll do a color grade, which can take weeks sometimes, where we're going from shot to shot to shot to optimize color and make sure that there is a consistency. We'll go through and do a 3D pass to make sure that the 3D is all working and that shots are transitioning smoothly from one to the next in terms of the 3D, so your eyeballs aren't pivoting around in your head. So the DI suite is really a fundamental part of the quality and finish of a film, but it's also massively expensive. DI suites start at about, sort of ballparking, but maybe $300 an hour in a boutique suite that's decent, up to $1,000 an hour in a facility that's got a guy who's won Oscars and can do a great job. And you oftentimes get what you pay for there. So.
All right, this is a huge topic and one that as we continue to evolve this document, there'll be more for you guys to read online, and certainly I think this is one where please reach out to the really skilled professionals in this room, budget appropriately for this. The challenge in our industry here is we have to maintain the highest resolution we can when you deliver the product, and this is the step that'll get you there. And that kind of leads us in, we're getting close to time here, but that leads us into versioning and mastering and what those deliverables are.
So back in the day, we would just make film prints. It was a 40-minute IMAX film. You make a film print, it goes to the theater, and you're done. These days, films are 2D, they're 3D, they're 40 minutes or 20-minute versions. You may have video-on-demand versions. You obviously have multiple language versions, DCPs. There's just a ton of stuff, hundreds of items with every film. And so, again, at the very beginning of the process, if you're smart, you want to figure out what you need to end up with at the end, because there are cost implications to putting all this stuff together. Sometimes the distributor will pick up some of those costs. Sometimes they expect the production to cover it. But there are also time, energy. If you're going to dimensionalize some of your footage, well, that takes time. Is that in your schedule and properly set up? So in terms of deliverables, knowing what you want to end up with and then working from the highest level of quality, which is typically the giant screen, working down from there is the way to go. If we start with the giant screen and the level of quality, everything from there will look good. If you start out with a television show and try and work up to the giant screen, you're going to be in trouble. And there are a number of shows out there now. Tiny Giants started as a television show. We worked incredibly hard. Like almost every single shot in that has been digitally extended, has been up-res. It was probably as much work to just finish that and make it look good on the giant screen as it was to make it a television show to begin with. So, just be smart about where you're starting and what your end result is going to be.
Yeah, and you'll see in the attached document that'll be available, like I said, in probably a month or two, maybe less. We have a pretty good list of deliverables, but this is a moving target, and it is important to understand with your distributor what they're going to require and what you're going to actually have to produce on your own, because it's a pretty exhaustive list. So anything else we can think of?
Just quickly on versioning, again, the digital technology is a great thing, but it also now means that we can create a bunch of different versions. So everybody wants their own version. Back in the day, you might have, there'd be an IMAX film with 5 separate language versions, and they would all travel around on their own. Now everybody wants a separate DCP. So you have Mandarin, you have Mexican Spanish, Sevillian Spanish. You have like all of these different versions. and all these different DCPs, it just becomes a real management task. And again, that management starts early on in the process. You don't want to wait until you've delivered a successful film to start thinking about how are we going to satisfy the market and the demands of the market. You need to have a strategy in place early.
I think that's would be my kind of summary, leads in nicely into how I would summarize this, is that, you know, pre-production is really changing, at least for me, that post and thinking about deliverables needs to be at the very front of what you're doing in preparing to make one of these films. And if you do that well and you put the right team together and have budgeted appropriately at the outset, you don't get to the end of the process and say, gee, I wish I had more money to do a sharpening pass, or it's really imperative that you expand what you're doing in pre-production, who you're talking to, and put together the right team and the right budget to be able to deliver for this wonderful format. So we have got some time for Q&A. If anybody's got questions, we're happy to answer or try.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Hello. It's not really a question. It's just that Myles you were very delicate in your description of the problem you had with your DIT, but suffice to say that I know something about it because it would involve a film that involved quite a few little insects that fly. And I'm just to say to any of my colleagues who are producing in the room, I am very happy to give you the name of that DIT.
Oof. I don't think he's in the business anymore. Well, he's certainly not in the giant screen business anymore.
One would hope not. Anyone else?
I guess, hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I guess it's an edit question. I'm new to this whole thing, but all of the IMAX films I've ever seen are very slow as far as editing is concerned, and I understand you've got a lot of real estate to scan your eyeballs. But the project I'm going to be working on is very high speed and, you know, very action-packed, let's say. And so I'm a little concerned, or do you have any tips on you know, editing too fast for a screen that size?
Sure. Again, you know, like I said, every project is unique. Just because we talk about how the pacing and rhythm should be a little bit slower than traditional film doesn't mean that every film has to be that way. So if the nature of your project requires quick cuts and things like that, you can do that. But you have to remember that the giant screen is much more of a physical effort than a traditional cinema screen. So if you're bombarding your audience with, you know, 12-frame cuts and things like that, you need to find a way to give them a bit of a break. And if you're doing it in 3D, it's even, you know, at that point, you may be physically harming them. So you need to be really conscious of it. But there are a lot of you know, dynamics on the giant screen that work and work well. You'll see, I think we did in Texas, the film Texas, the Big Picture, where we just did time-lapse driving around Texas, but at a frantic pace. And we're just cutting. But because the direction and speed of travel was more or less the same from shot to shot, it felt like it was flowing much more. Whereas if we were whip panning back and forth, you know, people will just start to pass out. So you just want to be thinking about what the physical impact is on people and be conscious of how long they can sustain that level of effort. Also be really aware that kids are much more tolerant of that kind of thing than adults, but we're making films for families, so it's always going to be a balancing act for sure.
Hi there. Could you talk a little bit about the 3D editing process? You mentioned a little bit briefly how you do it sort of near the end, but can you talk about how you do it as you're editing the film, and do you edit in 3D? And any suggestions and techniques for that?
How did you guys do it? You cut everything in 3D, right?
Yeah, we cut everything in 3D, mostly. Primarily, we use 3D and big, high-resolution 3D monitors to be able to do that. But it's kind of challenging. Sometimes I think it's easier to just cut in two.
We've done it a bunch of different ways. The way that we do it now, which I think is the best in terms of creativity, is that when we're in the field, we carry massive monitors. I mean, like, the 60-inch monitor, by the time it's in its plywood case and all that stuff, it probably weighs 220 pounds. But we get it out in the field in a tent running off a generator, and we watch our dailies in 3D. And it really helps the camera guys understand how it's working, and where it's not working, so that we're getting the very best material. When we get back to our offline suite, we'll watch it all again in 3D, and then we'll usually put the 3D aside and we'll cut it in 2D for a couple of reasons. One is just, unless you've got a $250,000 offline system, cutting everything at 4K and 3D is going to be really challenging. You're going to find yourself waiting a lot for renders and things like that. The second thing is that there's just a flow to editorial that doesn't necessarily require 3D. If you've got a good editor who understands 3D and you've got a director who knows 3D, they can make choices about the 3D while they're looking at the 2D. Not final choices, because they have to see it finally in 3D, but it just streamlines the process. And then normally what we'll do is at the end of every day, we're carrying a second video track that has the 3D content on it, and we'll just play back what we've done for the day just to make sure that everything's good, that the eyes aren't inverted or something like that. But that's kind of the workflow that we've been using lately, and it seems to work pretty well. The other nice thing is that because of the giant screen, we will have a giant projector and screen in our offline suite, like a 15-foot or bigger screen, and we can project and just park the director 5 feet away from that, so he can see, even in 2D, how things are playing and how it looks. So again, there's a big leap of faith. This is a translation. We're never really sure how it's going to look until we get it to the giant screen, but taking all these little steps helps us gain some level of comfort.
I know we're talking about picture here, but as we all know, most of these films are really motivated big time by sound. How does audio fit into this picture? Are we looking at a parallel workflow? Where are the points of intersection? And
if you on the back side of the picture workflow is the actual audio workflow.
Okay.
So there is a separate workflow for audio, and it is an absolutely critical step in the process here in Giant Screen. So there is a separate workflow for that.
I haven't looked at it, but are there points of intersection clearly noted on that?
Points of intersection.
Probably not.
I don't think they're clearly noted. No.
Okay, fair enough.
So that's about all the time we have. We're just really grateful to have the opportunity to kind of play with this topic a bit. And if you've got questions or anything that we can do to try and help you in your process, please see us afterwards. So thank you.
Thanks again, guys, just a glimpse, just an insight into some of the joys that you have to go through in the field to bring these wondrous experiences to us. Thank you very much.